When that momentous day of opening arrived, I was filled with disappointment, for the rain was falling. Mr. Elitch was nearly as sorrowful as I was, for we had made great preparations for the opening, and it seemed doomed to dismal failure. Looking back through the vista of years, I'm sure my sorrow was for him far more than for myself. I remember I prayed very fervently for a cessation of those May showers. As we stood in our doorway trying to encourage each other, a horseman dashed up to the gates. Excitedly hailing Mr. Elitch, he announced that all of Denver was moving over to Elitch's, that the train, packed to capacity, was laboring up the hill from the river, that coaches, carriages, delivery wagons, farm wagons, people on bicycles, and people afoot were headed for our opening. We then realized that Denver was ready for what we had to offer, and her people cared not for showers. But even as we bustled about in last-minute excitement, the glorious sun broke through the clouds. Many dear personal friends came to Colorado, especially to be with us. Among these were General and Mrs. Tom Thumb and Eugene Field, a reporter for the Denver Republican.
Following an elaborate picnic, Mary and John gave a vaudeville performance, which included comedy sketches, singers, dancers, and banjoists. A year later, 1891, the Elitch Theater became a reality.
Throughout the summer, we continued to present select vaudeville, getting the very best high-class acts. We also had orchestra and band concerts. I didn't really dream when we saw those acts on our stage what Elitch Gardens and the theater would become to the life of Denver.
Denver was busting at the seams toward the end of the 19th century. More and more people were making their way west, moving into the small town at the foot of the Rocky Mountains. More and more people were looking for entertainment. Entertainment away from the pioneer theaters that were mere adjuncts to the more important lines of business conducted in connection with them. Drinking and gambling went on day and night. Sunday was only a day that brought more business, and almost every kind of gambling and swindling device was kept in operation. And the miners who came in with their hard-earned gold dust were the principal victims, though many of the new arrivals who had not yet seen the mining districts lost every penny they had. Those pioneer theaters finally gave way to Elitch's, to the Empress, the Orpheum Theaters, and others in downtown Denver's Great White Way, which was illuminated by 10,000 electric lights and the marquees of 13 theaters. The Orpheum opened in 1903 and featured vaudeville with Groucho, Harpo, Chico, and Zappo, the Marx Brothers. Manhattan Beach opened in 1891 on the shores of Sloan Lake in northwest Denver. It burned in 1906, reopened, and folded before World War I. And there was Lakeside, which opened in 1908. Originally called White City, it billed itself as the Coney Island of the West. While Elitch's prospered, gold miners were pouring into the hills around Cripple Creek. Bob Womack, a part-time cowboy, staked his first claim at Poverty Gulch and named it the El Paso Lode. As a result, people poured into the area, and between 1891 and 1916, Cripple Creek's production reached $340 million. In Leadville, the glorious frenzy was gone. The price of silver dropped from $1.32 an ounce in 1872 to 84 cents in 1889. The mines that had paid millions sat almost idle. The Matchless, the Little Pittsburgh, the Morning Star, and the Chrysolite. Back in Denver, John Elitch relished in the success of that first season and decided to turn his attention full-time to the theatrical business. He organized the Goodyear, Elitch, and Schilling Minstrels and toured the Pacific Coast.
While playing at the old Alcazar Theater in San Francisco, John was stricken with pneumonia and passed away. He never saw a performance at Elitch's, nor did he see the theater building. For 2 years, I presented the best vaudeville procurable, following this with light opera for several seasons. And then I decided to organize my first stock company and present regular drama. The first legitimate theater was held in 1897. Our play was Helene by Martha Morton.
In 1896, the theater crowd also saw a first in the West. the Edison Vitascope, a newfangled contraption that actually made pictures move. It was the first motion picture projector, which in years later would cause a major decline in theater attendance throughout the world. Mary Elitch founded Children's Day at the Gardens. Every Tuesday of the summer belonged to the children of Colorado. She also founded a dance school, and Child's Companion, a free weekly newspaper, had a circulation of 15,000. For the next 17 years, between 1898 and 1915, the theater flourished and played mostly to sold-out houses. Mary Elitch was not only the talk of Denver, but the talk of the nation. In November 1900, she became the bride of Thomas Long, her box office manager. Long died 6 years later, and Mary Elitch never married again. In the summer of 1906, the divine Sarah came to the Gardens.
One of the most precious experiences of my career was my first meeting with Sarah Bernhardt. Our eyes met and there was no need for an introduction, and I never sought an explanation of what followed. The strange attraction that drew us and the bond of understanding that held us gazing into each other's eyes. Then, without a word, we were folded in each other's arms. We sighed together. We knew a common language, and we shared our delight in the knowledge, though our language was not the same.
Sarah Bernhardt gave 2 performances before packed houses in one day. Bernhardt and her French cast, along with the Elitch Theater Company, performed Camille in the afternoon and came back that evening with La Sorcerie. They were 2 of her favorite plays. Douglas Fairbanks' first experience in the theater was on the Elitch stage. He heard that a Shakespearean production was opening, but he didn't have enough money to buy a ticket. Fairbanks asked the janitor if he could do some work that would get him a ticket. When told no work was needed, he asked if he might scrub the stage. He did, and got a ticket to the play. Fairbanks was 12 years old. Several years later, in 1906, Fairbanks, a native of Denver, became an accredited member of Elitch Company. 4-year-old Antoinette Perry waded in the Elitch fish pond looking for goldfish. In 1908, at the age of 11, she gave her first lines on the Elitch stage. She played David Warfield's leading lady. Perry moved to New York and became one of Broadway's top producers. Her ultimate honor came when the Tony Awards, the Oscars of the motion picture industry, were named after her. In 1916, a group of prominent businessmen bought Elitch's from Mary Elitch Long. It had been a long and successful career for Mary, but it was time to settle into retirement. Mary continued to live in her bungalow at Elitch's and died in 1936. The group, headed by John K. Mulland, named Pennsylvania-born John M. Mulvihill to manage the park. Several years later, Mulvihill bought them out and became sole owner of Elitch's and the theater. He was an ardent lover of the arts, and in the years that followed, Mulvihill brought in such well-known stars as Helen Menken, Edward G. Robinson, Sylvia Sidney, Frederick March, Florence Eldridge, George Brent, and Harold Lloyd. Because of his guidance, the most outstanding talent in the theatrical world deemed it an honor to be included in an Elitch company, despite the fact that Mulvihill was a strict disciplinarian. According to Mulvihill law, no leading man would be married to his leading lady and perform at the theater. In 1926, the leading man was Frederick March. The leading lady was Florence Eldridge. They wanted to get married. Mulvihill told them, "Well, you know what will happen if you do." March said, "Oh, John, you wouldn't do that to us." "Try me," he said. March and Eldridge went to Colorado Springs one afternoon and got married. When Mulvihill got wind of the wedding, he called them both into his office and said, "Well, I understand that you are now man and wife." March grinned and said, "That's right, J.M. I love this girl too much to take the chance of losing her by waiting till the season's over." Mulvihill answered, "You know what I told you. One of you has to go. And Florence, I've already engaged another lady for your part. You can stay here with your new husband, of course, but you won't be acting in the Elitch Company." They were still married to each other when March died in 1975. In the mid-1920s in Colorado, the Depression was beginning to hit the eastern plains, and mining in the high country took an upturn when the price of gold went to a whopping $36 an ounce. In Denver, the Elitch Theater prospered as never before under the leadership of John Mulvihill. However, his dedication and hard work the last 14 years had taken its toll. Mulvihill died in January 1930. He was succeeded as president of the Gardens by his son-in-law, Arnold B. Gertler. Although the theaters in the East were struggling to survive in the 30s, Elitch's, under Gertler's management, continued to give the people of Denver the best talent and plays available. It was his vision that brought in actor Donald Woods, probably the most popular leading man ever to appear in Denver. In 1933, while playing in The Pursuit of Happiness at Elitch's, he was discovered by a motion picture scout and given a Hollywood contract. He skyrocketed to fame immediately and made his first movie in 1934 with Ronald Colman in Tale of Two Cities. He also played with Paul Muni in The Story of Louis Pasteur. Denver and the state were still in the midst of dust-biting depression. More and more people were moving to the city, looking for work, a new way of life. There were farmers and ranchers and cattlemen and miners and railroaders, all giving it their best shot. But few found work. By 1933, 1 in every 4 Coloradoans was out of work. Between 1930 and 1934, 56 of Colorado's 174 state and national banks closed. Despite the woes of the early 30s, there was still time to pause and still time to get away from it all. Fashion shows in the mid-30s, man-made snow, and skiing on Genesee Mountain. Skiing, the real kind, on Berthoud Pass, where the modern-day ski tow was the back end of an old Ford. And there were the famous who came to Denver in the mid-30s. John Philip Sousa and his band performed in front of the Denver Post. Charles A. Lindbergh flew into Stapleton Field in his Spirit of St. Louis. And the famous from the entertainment world found and fell in love with the Elitch Theater. Arnold Gertler, like his predecessor, Mulvihill, traveled to New York in the off-season looking for the best talent available. And it was a grueling search, sometimes taking 4 to 6 months to find the right talent. It was difficult to find talent who would spend an entire summer at the park doing a play a week and rehearsing the rest of the time for next week's play. One of those he interviewed was George Brent. Brent said, "Mr. Gertler, this is a tremendous honor, and I do want to be a member of your company because I understand that you pay your bills on time and that you pay your cast." Brent also had a friend he wanted Gertler to meet. "He's done almost nothing on Broadway," said Brent, a requirement the Elitch Company had for its cast members. But Brent pleaded so eloquently that Gertler agreed to see him for a few minutes. The man was Clark Gable. Gertler commented, "He's a fine young man, but he ought to get his ears fixed." Gertler also had his own theater law. He fired Edward G. Robinson because of his sloppy wardrobe. He warned him a couple of times, but Robinson didn't get around to doing anything about it. Gertler sent him back to New York. In 1941, the Elitch Theater celebrated its Golden Jubilee, 50 years as the oldest summer stock theater in the country. On July 16, 1941, the theater opened with Skylark, starring Donald Woods and Ruth Mattson, the play directed by George Soames. In attendance were Colorado Governor Ralph L. Carr, Denver Mayor Benjamin F. Stapleton, and other state and local officials. Gertler and Soames had been in New York that winter booking the best they could find. Other plays on that 50th anniversary were Golden Boy, The Philadelphia Story, The Royal Family, The Male Animal, The Man Who Came to Dinner, The Little Foxes, Mr. and Mrs. North, Ladies in Retirement, and Private Lives. Woods and Matson held the lead in all of the plays. Soames directed and played in The Man Who Came to Dinner, and Helen Bonfils played in The Royal Family and the final 7 plays. Oh yes, the cost to see a play was nightly, except Sunday, 40 cents to $1.25. Sunday evenings and matinees, 40 cents to 75 cents. Helen Bonfils was owner of the Denver Post and one of the great ladies of the Elitch Theater. She put forth great gusto and talent, playing her usual roles as housekeeper, maid, nurse, but she was no prima donna. Miss Helen was a delight. And later, when she became administrator of the theater, she mentioned to the publicity man that one week's show wasn't selling well. The PR man suggested more advertising, and Helen said, "Why, we can't afford that." The only place the theater spent any advertising money was, of course, in the Denver Post. While the theater was booming, so was the Elitch Trocadero. The season opened with Johnny Scat Davis and his band. He was followed by Glenn Gray and the Casa Loma Orchestra, featuring Pee Wee Hunt and Kenny Sargent. Ray Herbeck's band, Music with Romance. Jan Savitt and his Top Hatters, his theme song, It's a Wonderful World. And while Savitt was playing the truck, Ted Weems and his band opened at Lakeside's El Patio. His feature singer was Perry Como. But back at the truck, Ozzie Nelson and his orchestra with Harriet Hilliard, Griff Williams with Irish tenor Bob Kirk, and Raymond Scott and his orchestra. Yes, you could dance to them all. Ladies, 20 cents. Men, 40 cents. Matinees, ladies, free. Men, 25 cents. Toward the end of the 1941 season, war was becoming a reality, and in December it happened. Within a year, Denverites were learning air raid rules, sewing blackout curtains, conserving gasoline and tires. Lowry Air Force Base, dedicated in 1938, grew to more than 600 buildings where thousands of Army airmen learned aerial photography, bombing techniques, and low-level flying. The Elitch Theater remained open during the war years and continued to grow. Gertler, along with his sons Bud and Jack and Soames, continued their treks to New York to book shows and talent. And as in the days of Mulvihill, it wasn't easy. They sometimes spent 6 months in the Big Apple searching for the best in the business. Television and motion pictures had cut into the availability of stars wanting to do summer stock. In the late 40s and 50s, more and more name stars came to town. Raymond Burr and Patricia Neal, who starred in Joan of Arc, Donald Woods and Ruth Matson, and Helen Bonfils and George Soames continued to perform. In 1947, Jack and Bud Gertler took charge of Elitch's and the theater. Jack commented, "I was terribly stage-struck. I played every bellboy ever written in any of the shows we put on." Bud also performed in the theater on many occasions, and both did extra duty as theater ushers. When the new backstage was built in 1950, the Gertlers had the old dressing rooms repainted. The painters were told to paint everything, and they did just that, including the famed signature door on one of the dressing rooms. From the earliest days of the theater, those who played there had signed that door. It was a historical gem. Jack and Bud were so crushed, they toyed with the idea of shipping the door to the Lambs Club in New York and then on to Los Angeles, and to advertise in actors' magazines for the stars to come in and sign up again. They never did it. The Gertlers also cast a beautiful young lady who had very little theatrical experience, but pleaded to be in the cast of 1951. She'd been here about 10 days when one day a woman came to the theater looking for her. "I'm Mrs. Kelly from Philadelphia, and I want to see my daughter." Of course, The young lady was Grace Kelly. Mrs. Kelly figured her daughter was way out west in some broken-down summer stock company and would end up stranded before the season was over. She liked the park so much, she stayed the season with her daughter. In February 1952, Edward G. Robinson was doing Stalag 17 at the Auditorium Theater, and the Gertlers were able to get him back to visit Elitch's. One of Robinson's desires in visiting the theater was to sit in the vacant auditorium. He said when he was acting at the theater, he'd never had the chance to see what the stage looked like from that vantage point. About the same time, another gentleman showed up at the Elitch offices and asked to see the theater. He was told the park was closed. The man left his name, returned to his waiting cab, and left. The Gertlers, who were at lunch, returned and found it was Harold Lloyd. The theater had an incredibly loyal following through the years. 70 to 80% of ticket sales were season ticket holders. And if you wanted to be in the who's who of Denver, you better not miss an opening Monday night performance. It was society night at the theater, and the glitter rivaled the brightness of the park itself. The midway was crowded with tuxes and sparkling gowns. It was the social event of the summer for Denverites. Dinner in the Orchard Cafe, the theater, and dancing in the Troc till well after midnight. Society night came about thanks in part to Mary Elitch. She wrote a society column in the magazine The Elitch Gardener. One summer evening, the theater box office received a call from a lady who said, "I just read in the paper where Mrs. So-and-so died. She had seats 101 and 102 in row F. I would like for you to reserve those for me now." In 1964, Helen Bonfils took over the theater and named Whitfield Connor her executive administrator. Connor, like Bonfils, also acted in many of the plays, including FDR in Sunrise at Campobello. Bonfils did away with the summer stock company and instituted the star system, which continued through the 1987 season. In Bonfils' first season, she brought in Hal March, Cesar Romero, Walter Pidgeon, and Darren McGavin, plus a host of other big-name stars. Those who played at the theater for the next 23 years read like a who's who in the entertainment world. They all wanted to play at the oldest summer theater in the United States. In 1987, the theater presented the play Nonsense, starring Denver native Mary Jo Catlett. The following year, the incredible Acrobats of China came to the Gardens. And in 1989 and 90, well-known musical artists such as Ray Charles and Emmylou Harris appeared at the Elitch Theater. During this period, the fourth generation of Gertlers became president of the park. Sandy Gertler, son of Bud, followed in his father's footsteps. The 1991 season, Legitimate Theater returns to the Gardens with two plays. A bluegrass musical comedy starring Patrick Cassidy as the robber bridegroom, followed by a murder mystery, Plot Within a Plot, starring Gary Sandy of WKRP radio fame. Sandy stars in Rupert Holmes' Accomplice. Who's the guy with the beard? It's Gary Sandy, who played Travis on WKRP, rehearsing for a love musical, one of the 1984 plays at the Elitch Theater. The Elitch Theater rolls into its 100th year, and once again, legitimate theater, which Mary Elitch so loved, is back in the Gardens.